Hi, good morning to our audience in Mexico, and good afternoon to all of you joining us from Europe. I'm Érika Ruiz Sandoval, and I welcome you to the third online edition of the EU-Mexico Think Tank Dialogue Initiative. Today, we will be talking about the economic consequences of COVID-19, something that has made us all sleepless lately. Just some data. The International Monetary Fund warned last week that the global economy is expected to contract by 3% this year because of economic damage from the coronavirus pandemic, the worst downturn since the Great Depression. On April 15th, it stated, "This is a crisis like no other," and warned that the economic repercussions will be severe, particularly for emerging markets and developing countries, commodity exporters, and economies with weak health systems that, after what we've seen, is most of the world. In the case of the European Union, COVID-19 is a major economic shock as it has disrupted global supply chains, caused volatility in financial markets, consumer demand shocks, and negative impacts in key sectors such as travel and tourism. In mid-March, the European stock market fell around 30% compared to the previous month. And this was the sharpest monthly decline since the start of the financial crisis in 2008. In the case of Mexico, the currency has depreciated 30% between the end of February and the third week of March, and it is foreseen that it will worsen as the COVID-19 crisis continues. In Mexico, key sectors for the economy have also been affected. For example, tourism and remittances coming from the United States and exports will also be reduced due to the global economic situation. All this along with the collapse of oil prices yesterday, which have reached the lowest levels, and that of course have a direct impact on the state's income. So to better understand what are the main impacts this health crisis has brought to both the European Union and Mexico, we will talk with Cinzia Alcidi, head of the Economic Policy Unit at the Center for European Policy Studies in Brussels, Enrique Díaz-Infante Chapa, Director of the Financial Sector and Social Security Program at the Centro de Estudios Espinosa Yglesias, Niclas Poitiers, Research Fellow at Bruegel and an expert on international trade, international macroeconomics, and the digital economy, and Federico Rubli, Partner and Consultant at MAT Advisors in Macroeconomics, International Economics, and Pension Systems, as well as an associate member of the Mexican Council on Foreign Relations, COMEXI. As the conversation moves along, feel free to post your questions on the online chat on this webinar, addressing them to a particular expert. All participants can see them, and at the end, we'll select a few of them for them to answer. Apologies in advance in case we do not get to answer all of them live. So let's begin. The first question goes to both Cinzia Alcidi and Federico Rubli. Can you describe the state of play for both the European and the Mexican economies? What are the main policies implemented to address the economic impacts of the pandemic, and who have they specifically targeted? We will start with Cinzia. Given the nature of the European Union, could you please cover both measures at the European level and give us some concrete examples from some member states? You have 5 minutes, Cinzia.
Maybe some of it from such a COVID-19 crisis. This is really an exceptional crisis. It starts as a health crisis, which is now turning into an economic crisis because basically there is no vaccine, there is no cure for this virus, and basically the only measure that we know to basically cope with this situation is the lockdown. And basically, the lockdown is, if you want, the main catalyst for the economic impact of the crisis. Then, of course, there are many more, like uncertainty, but of course, the lockdown is the first, which basically entails a stop in the supply, basically across many different sectors, and the stop in the demand. Basically, we are in a situation where our ability to consume, to buy goods is limited. Certain services like tourists going to a restaurant is not possible anymore. And this is basically is the source of, if you want, the first round of impact. As I mentioned already, the impact across sector is likely to be in some sector much deeper, in some sector maybe a return to normality once the lockdown measures are basically relaxed. And a number of relaxation of the lockdown measures. Actually, few like are already implementing relaxation. However, experiencing a situation whereby the lockdown is relaxed and then some certain measures will have to be reintroduced. So uncertainty is extremely high. Now, what has been the response to a situation whereby production is stopped for a large part, consumption cannot be fully implemented, uncertainty is keeping investment very low, and the number of people basically are experiencing losses in income. Now, in Europe, the social welfare is actually very rich, if you want. And governments, basically, in all member states, have tried to put in place a series of measures in order to basically mitigate the effect of the crisis. And these measures range from, of course, an increase in expenditure for health in order to strengthen the health systems. And we also realize extended to businesses, liquidity to businesses, tax deferred, and then also employment schemes. So in Europe, what we are seeing is more employment schemes rather than unemployment schemes. So the attitude of the government has been mostly to try to make sure that people are not fired. So these are the measures at the level of the member states, which to some extent have been different because the response has been different. Italy and Spain are in a very different situation than Germany, for instance, or the Netherlands and other countries. Now, this context, the European Central Bank have responding in to basically complement and support member states in
We are losing you, Cinzia.
Érika?
Could you turn off your phone, please, Cinzia? Now we can hear you, but we need you to turn off your phone. Oh, your camera. They're telling me it's not the phone, it's the camera. Okay, we'll try to sort this technical issue with Cinzia. She will come back, but so far she's given us some idea of how many supportive measures have been implemented in the different member states of the European Union and also measures at the European level. So we'll now turn to Federico Rubli for the same kind of setting the stage, but for the Mexican case. You have 5 minutes, Federico.
Okay.
Yes, but we're going to go to Federico and then we'll come back to you, Cinzia.
Okay.
Federico, please. We have Federico.
Hello?
Yeah. Yes, we can hear you. Can you? Yes, 5 minutes, please.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much for the invitation. Well, as you all know, the world has been hit by these two unexpected shocks, the coronavirus and the oil price shock. The coronavirus has reminded us that globalization may also include pandemics. Now, the combination of both shocks will lead to one of the worst world recessions since the Great Depression. Now, the shocks include both an aggregate supply shock, destroying supply chains and rising unemployment, as well as a demand shock, which has been hitting basically consumption levels. Now, in order to fight this pandemic, basically, I would say that 3 measures have been instrumented by most countries for flattening the contagion curve. First, preparing as best as you can the infrastructure of your health systems. Second, make as many tests as you can. And third, the social lockdown and confinement in homes. In Mexico, on all 3 accounts of measures, we have been very deficient. Our healthcare system does not have the necessary installed capacity due to big budget cuts implemented since last year. We are the 3rd worst country in the world with 1.4 beds per 1,000 inhabitants. Second, we are performing very few tests, only 3 for 100,000, which is of course very low. There are simply not enough tests. And thirdly, the government showed a lack of seriousness for adopting the lockdown and with a weak enforcement. Hence, I would say that clearly the government in Mexico underestimated the diagnosis, both of the pandemic and the economic impact. Besides, we have to remember that the economy comes from a very bad 2019 cycle. We had a mild recession, 0.1% contraction of GDP, stagnated investment for more than 15, 16 months, weak public finances. The state oil company Pemex is in operational and financial distress, and there has been a significant deterioration in confidence and trust in public policies. There is a perception of absence by the government of execution capacity. This, of course, has been compounded by this crisis. Now, turning now to economic policy, there is an agreement in the world that this emergency calls for extraordinary actions, such as counter-cyclical public expenditure policy. This implies running temporary fiscal deficits and the rise in public debt. Most countries have done it in order to transfer resources directly to the most affected population, small businesses and households. This support, depending on the country, has been to 20% of GDP. However, Mexico does not have a plan. President López Obrador has been completely reluctant to adopt counter-cyclical policies. On the contrary, he is stressing austerity, he does not want to redirect expenditure policies, and he does not want to establish a collaborative pact with the private sector in order to address this crisis together. He has only increased marginally the support through the social programs, which all in all amount to a meager 0.3% of GDP. Also, what will worsen the social and economic impact is the size of the informal sector we have in Mexico. 6 out of 10 in the workforce are informals. And for most of them, the lockdown is simply not an option. As many of them have said, my children are not coronavirus, they are going hunger. Hence, programs for the informal workers are necessary and should be a priority, simply due to humanitarian reasons. So, as expected, the result of all what I have mentioned will be a severe recession. Estimates of the decline of GDP for Mexico are around 8 to maybe 9.5%, which will be the worst recession since 1932 that we will have, with, of course, massive unemployment and closures of businesses and increasing poverty. Finally, let me also mention an important factor. So far, the problem has been contained to shocks to supply and demand. That is what we economists call the real economy. But what has to be avoided is that these real disturbances translate to the financial sector, and then that we may have a financial crisis on top of the problems. So far, the Mexican financial sector has been maintaining open credit lines and being very flexible for renegotiating debts with clients. The central bank has also done its work by opening liquidity facilities for preserving the well-functioning of the payment system. If not, we know the story of financial crisis very well. A massive rise in past due loans leading to bankruptcies and a full-fledged crisis. Thank you.
Thank you very much to both for giving us this initial perspective. Now let's move to the realm of public finances. Last week, G20 leaders have asked finance ministers and central bank governors to develop an action plan in response to COVID-19. Important measures have already been put forward by the IMF, the World Bank, and other international financial institutions to help countries in need, using all instruments to the fullest extent possible as part of a coordinated global response. Further adoption and swift implementation of a strong financial response to help countries in need and to uphold global financial stability and resilience have been discussed. Despite these efforts, the countries will experience a deep recession that will have an impact on their public finances and thus in the economy of the citizens. Enrique Díaz-Infante in Mexico, to what extent the country will issue public debt and what will be the effects in terms of social security for most Mexicans? You have 5 minutes.
Thanks, Érika. Hello to everyone. First of all, I would like to thank European Union for this opportunity, and I will say that the comments that I will produce here are based on research that we at the Center of Studies Espinosa Yglesias has been done in the last, I will say, month. First, as you just mentioned, Érika, based on what the International Monetary Fund said, Mexico is going to contract in his economy, in its growth, to a level of minus 6%. Probably we do not do anything else. Secondly, we are very concerned at the Center of Studies Espinosa Yglesias of the consequence that this crisis could have in poverty. We, based on the numbers of the crisis of '94 in Mexico, we consider that based on income poverty, around 21 million Mexicans could go into poverty. That means that in the end of the crisis, if nothing is done properly, we will end with 82 million poor people. So, and also we see that unemployment is going to reach between 1 million and 1.6 million workers. So, and that's in the formal sector. So, what are the measures that the government is taking to deal with this crisis? We can see that there are some monetary measures that the central bank is pursuing, fine, but the fiscal policies are quite limited. We can see that compared with the rest of the world is spending like 4.2% of its GDP to tackle the crisis, while in Mexico we are roughly spending like 1% at the moment. So we need to follow bazooka policies to avoid the loss of employment and the bankruptcy of many companies, as it seems the case. And if you compare, as I mentioned, the world is employing 4.2% of the GDP. We can see that other countries in Latin America, like Brazil, Argentina, and some others, Brazil 0.1% of the GDP, Chile 2.9% of the GDP, and Argentina 2.4% of the GDP. And some of them, like Argentina, are in a worse fiscal position. So we are really, as Federico just mentioned it, we are really surprised that in Mexico we are having problems to launch a program. So that's why at the Center of Studies Espinosa Yglesias, we just figure out some kind of measures to deal first with the crisis in health. Secondly, with the problem of unemployment in the formal sector and in the informal sector, and to deal with the bankruptcy of many small and medium enterprises. To that extent, we are proposing to put around 0.50% of, I mean, measures that are going to be like around 3 to 3.5% of the GDP. So President López Obrador says that he already put 1% money to support the poor people in his programs, great, which is fine. But we think that we need 3 to 3.5 more money on that to help with an insurance on unemployment for unemployment, to recover the budget of the health sector, to support the small and medium enterprises, to support the population in the formal sector, and to have some kind of support in tax refund. So this is the kind of policies that we at the Center of Studies Espinosa Yglesias are proposing to the government, and we really expect the government to listen to us and to listen to this conversation. Very important.
Thank you very much, Enrique. Now let's move on to another important issue regarding an economic crisis, and that would be trade. The President of the European Council, Charles Michel, and the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, participated last week in a G7 leaders video conference on COVID-19 and highlighted the importance of trade for overcoming the immediate crisis and ensuring a robust economic recovery. However, we have already seen developments in the opposite sense. Therefore, for example, Ireland has warned against a corona-induced temptation to deglobalize and urged its EU partners to avoid the trap of protectionism. Niclas Poitiers, do you think that this crisis threats the free trade in general, and for the specific case of the European Union, free trade being the cornerstone of the whole construction of European integration? Will EU member states stay together and continue free trading? You have 5 minutes. Niclas? Niclas? We lost Niclas?
Niclas, can you unmute yourself?
There we go.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
It's very good. So I think that, first of all, greetings from Brussels. So everyone on this call is safe and healthy, and their loved ones too. I think, first of all, so distinguish a bit between EU, intra-EU, and extra-EU. So I think the basically intra-EU trade has been, so there's been significant hurdles to trade in the EU. Basically, we have put up boundaries, the borders again, that were kind of vanished, and it was quite a struggle for the European Commission to make sure that goods in actually traded more or less freely, even though the movement of people is major disrupted. So you cannot just go into many countries, you cannot move into many countries in and out again. But I'm pretty confident this will be a temporary issue. I mean, there's some challenges for the European Union in the sense that the European Union, there's a lot of discontent, especially in Southern Europe. But this is more on the fiscal side, that they believe they should get more support from the Northern European countries to finance a recovery program, to finance the expenditures to make up for the economic losses, than it has to do actually with trade disruptions. But to move more to the global side, we see major backlashes against international trade, both politically, but we also have seen basically a breakdown of international trade that might have major repercussions in the future. So the WTO, we are still, within many of these figures, we're flying in the dark, but the estimates of the WTO of the decline in global trade are between 12% and 30%. 30% would be something around we've seen in the Great Depression. 12% would be something more what we've seen in 2008-9. This will hopefully be temporary, but with all these projections, as with the GDP growth projections, it really depends on the speed of the recovery, if we manage to contain the coronavirus, and or if we have further outbreaks and the repercussions of that. So there's major downside risk. So there's major downside risk on just economic numbers. So basically, flights are declined by 90%. Many shipments are delayed because the supply chains are disrupted. All this decreases international trade, and on top of that, starting of a discussion where due to the shortages of medical equipment in many countries, there's basically an emergence of a discussion that says maybe we are too much reliant on international value chain for some strategic goods. I think this is something, a pushback against internationalization, that we will probably see even after the immediate crisis will hopefully recede eventually. So basically, for Mexico, there are two major things at play. So EU-Mexico trade is actually not that big, except maybe in automotive industry. So a lot of cars by European producers are produced in Mexico. Of course, they're dependent on the pickup of carbon in the automotive sector. And the automotive sector is actually one of the sectors that will be hit the worst. Because it's a big good, the very expensive expenditure that actually can delay easily. Normally, it's not like a food that you buy or something like that, like a consumption good that if you're doing worse, that you still have to buy. It's something that you only buy a big expensive car if actually you're in a good economic position. The other thing for Mexico, I think the more important thing for Mexico is probably not the EU, but the US. 5% of Mexican exports go to the United States, and the way the trade is, the crisis is handled in the United States will have major repercussions on the exports that Mexico can make to the United States. The second big issue that we see right now, which is an international trade issue, if you like, is basically the oil price collapse and the flight of emerging market currencies. So we've seen a massive flight of emerging market currencies to safe haven currencies, particularly the euro, Swiss franc, but also mainly the US dollar. This has also led to the decline of the peso that Érika was mentioning in the beginning, and this also this is also driven by the decline in oil price. So yesterday we had this massive collapse of oil price going to minus 40%, minus $40 for price of oil in the United States. This is kind of an idiosyncrasy for the United States because there was basically a lack of storage. But Mexico being very much integrated in the United States, this also applies to Mexico. But also, if you look at Brent prices, which are basically the more reflective of the international market of oil, we are now at $20, which is below many production costs. So the Pemex, so the Mexican big oil company, already is now downgraded to junk in their bonds. This will have repercussions for Mexican exports and for the peso price as well. So I think there's many headwinds against international trade that go beyond what we already seen before the crisis, and it's very much open now how bad this crisis will be and how bad the backlash against globalization will be.
Thank you very much, Niclas. Now I have some questions for all the four of you. And in the case of Cinzia, we would like you to start, once I give you the floor, with a 2-minute summary of the last part of your intervention that we could not hear because of technical issues. The two questions are as follows. You're all economists, and this is kind of a textbook case of what to do: counter-cyclical measures, take care of the financial markets, beware of fiscal policy, etc., etc. But there's another variable, which is politics. What would be your comment regarding that? And my second question is, what can Mexico and the European Union do together to better weather the storm? Niclas just mentioned that our trade is not that relevant in terms of amount, but we do have a close connection. We have a global agreement in place and some strong trade bonds. Is our partnership strong enough to overcome this unprecedented crisis through trade and cooperation? Can we look for help in each other? Cinzia, you have the floor for 3 minutes in your case 5.
Okay, thanks very much. I hope now it will be smoother. My first intervention, I was just emphasizing what has been the role of the European Union in trying to provide a response to the pandemic, in particular to take into consideration the fact that the impact of the coronavirus has been asymmetric across countries, and basically Italy, Spain, and other southern countries have been exposed to an impact much deeper and larger than northern countries. I mean, there is a big question on the why, and one crucial element is, of course, public finances. And to some extent, what Enrique mentioned for Mexico, also for some Southern European countries, Italy has, for instance, a very large debt. So its room of maneuver to respond in a counter-cyclical way to the crisis is basically much more difficult. Spreads on bonds are increasing. So this is a signal that markets are a bit nervous when it comes to the increase in debt. And this is basically why there has been so much emphasis and so much debate at European level on what to do. And a common response to find a way to respond to, for instance, raising money at the European level, so as a whole, and providing some resources to the countries in need at very favorable conditions, or even to put in place a system potentially of transfer, like if it were a common budget, like in the United States, a sort of federal budget, which could provide resource to member states who need the most. And at this stage, I think politics come in, because in fact, it's very difficult to reach an agreement at 27 on what kind of tools. And I think one major issue there is a certain degree of mistrust among the governments of the different member states, and basically the capability to use the effective way. There is a sort of tension between the severity of the crisis, which is clearly very large, and the linkages, especially the economic linkages in terms of trade, in terms of belonging to the same value chain, makes a shock which is particularly deep in a certain country actually relevant for everyone. And this idea that basically transfers from one member state to another member state is something which is not acceptable at Europe. So this is where the politics come in. And what I was mentioning earlier is that on Thursday, we will have a very important meeting of the finance minister, where we hope that an agreement will be reached for a sort of bazooka, if you want, coming from the European level, who could support the countries who are most. Now, maybe one final element, and the linkage is also with Mexico. Many countries are actually in a situation which is quite similar. This is a pandemic, and so coordination would be the right answer. And I think at the level of, there has been a call for more coordination. Now, as a matter of fact, and this is very the nasty reality, is that in this situation, countries tend to look at their own interest and the way actually to protect the national interest more. So there is this big clash between the law for coordination and an action which actually is so much focused on the national interest. And I think I will stop here for the moment. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Cinzia. Federico?
Yes.
3 minutes.
Okay. Well, Mexico is a very economy, and we favor free trade among nations. When the global agreement was renegotiated, there was great hopes that it would increase trade volumes and, importantly, diversify our trade from Mexico. No? However, of course, this strategy is now on hold, since under conditions of a recession, it's in both economies, the EU and Mexico, it's very difficult to promote the trade expansion, simply because demand for imports and supply of exports are both stagnant. Hence, the precondition for taking advantage of the trade opportunities that we might have, and there are many, is first to overcome the recession in both regions. Now, of course, on one global challenge that has to be overcome is that the pandemic will likely lead to a reassessment of globalization's costs and benefits. One has to remember that the restriction to trade and capital flows is an attractive option in bad times. So the post-coronavirus world trade architecture will face a tough reconstruction towards a regime, which was already under criticism and attack before the crisis. No? So I think we will have to wait a while until we can really take advantage of the agreement with the EU.
Okay, thank you very much, Federico. Enrique.
Yes, Érika, I am really pleased that you ask about politics and what will be the consequence of this crisis, talking about politics. And I think that it very much depends on the answer of President López Obrador in the case of Mexico to the crisis. Up to the moment, the answer has been very poor and not very empathic with the middle class, with the companies and with the productive sector. So we'll see if that will not damage his presidency. At the moment, we have seen that in the last year, he has diminished his popularity in polls from 78% to 58%. And also we are a little bit concerned. He's putting a lot of money on the militaries. He's giving money for a new airport to the militaries, which is going to be our commercial airport. He is also giving a lot of money to build some facility for a bank. But the problem here is that there is no opposition in place after the 2018 elections, and only the Morena party is really in place. So we'll see if there's a fragmentation within the party because of the crisis and because of the download in the popularity of López Obrador. So most likely in the 2021 elections, the opposition, because there are still parties, the PRI, the PAN, together with two other parties, may win the Congress, and López Obrador is not going to have, as he has at the moment, majority in the Congress. He has the presidency, he has majority in the Congress, he also have the Supreme Court, and he has the legislative power. So he has a lot of power, and there's a lot of concentration of power. So we expect to have less concentration of power after the 2021 elections.
Thank you so much. Niclas, are we playing politics with trade too, particularly between the EU, China, the US?
Yes, we do. So we see right now a bit of a beggar your neighbor policy everywhere introduced. So we've seen for more than 70 countries now restriction on exports of medical goods. Many of these are intended to kind of protect the local production and protect the local population. So kind of the idea is that if you produce something in your country and you have people in need, you don't want to export it. So it seems kind of a reasonable strategy. The problem is that there's many cross-country, cross-boundary, these are kind of international supply chains. And if everyone does that, first of all, the countries that don't produce this kind of goods themselves lose out. But also many of these products are reliant on inputs from other countries. And if these countries put restrictions on themselves, kind of very quickly this production can break down. So I think it's a dangerous policy. It has it's like the disease is a
show support partner and the neighbors. I think much more emphasis has been put now. That is a bit my interpretation for the allocation of the different shares that say that, I mean, the EU budget, which is actually very the entire It's basically a very small. Not all the areas unused.
Okay, we're losing you again, Cinzia. Unfortunately, technology it's not cooperating this time around. We're about to finish, and just a quick question to Enrique and Federico. Enrique first. Can you think of any political setting in the current government regime in which your suggestion could be realistic, in which there would be another way to deal with the crisis in Mexico?
Well, a realistic political setting, I think that this government is going to realize that he needs private sector, private investment in energy. So I think that this government is going to invite private investment. I don't know if it's going to work because of the political actions that he has followed before. There is no and the private sector, but the government position is going to be better than in the beginning. The government needs the private sector. But in any case, I think that talking about what's going to happen, I think that in 2021, as I just mentioned it, Morena party is going to lose majority in the Congress because of this crisis and the bad policies that the current government has pursuing. So that's what I expect, and I really hope that this government listen to our proposals. And finally, to the audience, I would like to provide the web page of the CEEY. As I just mentioned it, all the proposals that I mentioned it here are based on our document. Is that possible?
Put it on the chat. Thank you, Federico.
Thank you.
Hold any hope?
Well, thank you very much. Well, unfortunately, I hate to say it, but I'm not very optimistic. First, on the coronavirus, in the next couple of weeks, we're going to see the worst of this crisis. We will reach the peak of infections, and as I mentioned, we simply are not prepared to face this. So we only have to hope for the best in that sense. On the economic side, I'm also not very optimistic because of what I said. This reluctance of President López Obrador to take into account the private sector, as Enrique already mentioned. There is a clear, open confrontation with investors and with the private sector, no? And as long as there is no access, direct access of transfers to small businesses and to households, you will not have a relief. And the president, unfortunately, thinks that he doesn't want to bail out businesses, because he says first are the people, first are the poor. But he doesn't understand that the people work in the small businesses. So you are not bailing out businesses. You are, as a matter of fact, bailing out workers. No? All in all, what I see, and as I mentioned, I'm not very optimistic. As I see things today, I think we will have a recession, a very, very severe recession, maybe a decline in GDP between 8 and 9.5%. Just to keep this into perspective, the 94-95 recession was minus 6.3%, and the 2009 recession was minus 5.3. So this is going to be worse. No? And well, I really would like to have better news, but I'm not very optimistic.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for throwing some light on this twin crisis. We do not only have a health crisis, but we have an economic crisis going on, particularly for the European Union and Mexico, but also for the rest of the world. I believe it will take all of our political will and creativity to overcome all the consequences of what's going on. And I certainly believe Mexico and the European Union at some point will have to cooperate and talk to each other to move forward. We thank the audience for joining us. We definitely thank our participants for your generosity with your time and your knowledge. And we invite you to connect next Tuesday, same time, same place, to talk about climate change and COVID-19. Thank you all, and see you next time. Be safe.